Thanks. First, thanks everyone for coming today. So my name is Lea. I've been working in brand and product in Web3 since 2018, and I'm here to talk today about brands and how they exist in Web3 and how we can create brands that not only speak to but also engage with the Web3 community. So for the story, before I worked in crypto, I was working in design agencies, and I was a little bit shocked and disappointed by what I was seeing when I arrived in 2018. I didn't put anything here because I didn't want it to offend anyone, but for the ones who were here in these dark times, you know what I mean. And I thought I could, and I thought I had to make a change, but crypto changed me. Or more precisely, it changed the way I understand and perceive brands as a whole. Let's start with how brands actually begin from the very beginning. So the word brand itself comes from the Old Norse, and it is a symbol that was burned onto animals in a cattle. So you would know to which farmer it would belong to. But there are symbols of ownership that are a lot older than that, like the ones you see here, that were used by masons and potters, engraved on their production, so they would get paid for what they do and would also serve as a little advertising. I would also argue that political and religious symbols through history are a really good example of branding. There's a lot of meaning behind the colors and the symbols that are used. And they were used also pretty much everywhere, just like logos, brands are used today, on clothes, on buildings, on objects, etc. But we have to wait until the late 19th century for things to become a little bit more official with trademarks. And it happened because of Industrial Revolution. There was a mass production, there was a lot more competition, and companies wanted to protect their production. And that's where trademark appeared. And maybe I'm in front of it, but if you're in Berlin, you probably know that one. It's actually the oldest trademark that has been registered for Pilsner beer. It hasn't changed so much since. After that, in the 20s, we have the radio era, where advertising through radio becomes a lot more important. We see targeted messaging, we see catchphrases, we see jingles. Doesn't mean that all the touch points didn't exist. As you can see here, like there was advertising in journals, there was still packaging, but radio was really the first time that you could diffuse a message to a very broad audience very fast. Also in the 40s and the 50s with the TVs, a lot of things changed for the brands, became a lot more emotional, and companies started taking a little bit more seriously and developed the concept of brand management, which is what marketing is today, basically. It's only in the 80s that we start seeing brands that are identities or that embrace existing identities. And it leads to a certain form of brand-led consumerism where people would buy a product not for its intrinsic value and how well it's done or anything, but for the brand that is behind. Good examples of these brands in the 80s and 90s would be Vans for skaters, Doc Martens for workers, or also the Supreme for urban culture. And it worked very well because today it's still the case, it's still associated with the subcultures and people still wear them. So a definition I really like, I found online from Brian Lisher, going to read today, is a brand is a way a product, company or individual is perceived by those who experience it, much more than just a name or a logo. A brand is the recognizable feelings these assets evoke. And that's the first thing I usually tell my clients when we work together. When they think brand, they think logos. Like, no, the logo is part of an ecosystem and there's a lot more to it. So now, what changed? Let's talk a little bit more about Web3. You're probably familiar already with the differences between Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3, but let's go through it together. It's not only about interaction, it's about owning something that you have received or that you have created yourself. It's about different touch points, ways to engage with the community, such as live stream, which makes the whole experience a lot more immersive. It's about a web that is not only passive, but it's about a web that is active, that is run by algorithm, automated and semantic, and data spaces that are interconnected. Next, no matter if you're in Web 1, in Web 2, in Web 3, or in the 19th century, if you want to present your brand, you have to use different brand markers to identify it and communicate it. The visual ones are logo, font, colors, visuals. Visuals can be logos, can be pictures, can be videos. And we have the content one, name, catchphrases, tone of voice, nothing new. This could already be trademarked in the 19th century. But the new thing is the experience. Brand experiences existed before in a much more physical way. They were very expensive, very difficult to organize, usually in form of an exhibition, a sport event, a conference. Having worked for DappCon this year and the last edition, I can confirm it's a lot of work. It's actually a lot easier to push an app or a website than doing something more physical. And how can the UX be a brand marker? It can be simple, it can be complex, it can be fast, it can be rich. And the UI itself is not only a brand marker, but it's also englobing everything you have here, so everything that is visual and content, to create UI components that together will form the interface according to a design system. And the other brand markers are also expressed through touch points. So here you can see they're divided between ownable, non-ownable, interactional, non-interactional. Ownable here means that it's something that you have full control over. You can burn it, you can sell it, you can stake it, you can do anything you want over it. No one can say anything about it, no one can take it away from you. The non-ownable ones can still be owned in a certain way that you can identify with it, but it's not really yours in that way. And if you want to engage with your community, ideally you create brand touch points and focus on brand touch points that are rather ownable and interactional. It's just much more engaging. So now let's talk about the community and who is the Web3 community. It's a lot of people. It's followers, it's users, it's builders. Literally everyone who is around the project can also be DAO members in case of a DAO. And why we're talking about it today is because they're really important in a brand. They were already important in the past, but it was more of a discussion between the brand as a separate entity and the community. Now, because we have new channels of communication, because we have new governance systems, community became really part of the brand itself. It affects its reputation, it shares information through meme, reappropriates the codes. So it's not something we can really neglect. Even if we don't think about it, it's there anyway. And so we talked about who the people are, but it's actually very difficult to know who they really are the way we would with traditional medias. We don't have a lot of information about people, and pretty much everybody in the space is trying to protect their data. So it's not like we can create a typical marketing persona and saying, oh, it's Anna, she lives in France, she's 26 years old, she likes to go to the market on Sunday, and that's what she bought last week. But we can still find what the people like through their social media, and we also see that all the traditional distinctions, like political, national, sociological, are not as important as principles that bind people together. And all these identities or extend it to a network. And they exist and shift at the intersection of different identities. It means that we don't work so much with monocultures as we used to be. You can, if I give a concrete example, you can be an emo kid on TikTok and put some rap music over your video. As an old emo kid, if I was listening to rap with my friends, I would be pushed away by the community. But now people are embracing that, and I think that's something important to consider when we're thinking about the communities now. And the third point is we generate data that is used by algorithms to form these cultures, and they influence us in return. So what can we do if typical personas are dated, monocultures are disappearing? Well, something we cannot do is to surf on trends and focus on technical limitations, because both of them are short-lived, but we can create cultures instead. We can create a brand that points at a larger goal, something that is common to anyone to engage communities on the long term. And again, I have some examples that worked very well. Sadly not in Web3, because it's been not long enough to really talk about long-term success, but we can think about Apple, for example. They don't sell only computers, but they rather sell a future self that is creative and free. We can think about, sorry, got my note on my wrist. Can we cut that from the video? Yeah, we can think also about Reddit, more like Web2 example. They don't only sell a chat, but they sell the possibility to find and being part of one or more communities at once. And all these brands still exist now, so it's a proof that actually works. So now let's talk about what actually works also between communities and brands. There is one kind of superpower we can use, and that's the memes. Memes are a pretty good way to create and engage communities and also give them the codes to communicate all that by themselves and identify with it. And that's the last quote of this presentation. Thanks, Hallie. Memes on the internet took what is already naturally occurring in the way that we communicate and supercharged it by making it global and simple. That's pretty much all about memes, really. And to close the circle, how can we make a meme about a brand? And that's where we can use the brand markers. Here you can see you have symbols, you have colors, you have the name. Also, the face of the company is very important. If you don't have any of these brand markers or identifiers, people will just not know what you're talking about. If you're creating a brand, you can also think about all the different brand markers and try to make it so that they're easily identifiable and ownable by the community. A little bit meta, but sometimes a meme becomes a brand itself. Here you can see an example of the Doge coins, or the Easter Rock, the SO2 project that worked very well, usually short-lived, again, because there's no bigger picture. It's hard to scale when it's about one specific trend or idea. So takeaways, how can we build strong and lasting brands in Web3? First, make room for change. No one is going to wait for you, if you don't anyway. Think global. Think about really anyone you can think of. Sometimes you just don't think about people and they become your strongest community and your strongest ally. Important also to be accessible in that way. Engage with your community, you can give them a role and a purpose. Building systems, and by that I don't only mean design system with brand markers and touch points like we talked about before, but also communication systems, governance systems, and see how they all interact together and can scale. And more importantly than anything I talked about before, actually, stay genuine. It's really important to not overthink something, because in the end, people will notice it. And that's it for today. Thanks for coming to my talk. I believe we have some questions there. I don't know why I'm clapping for myself.
Thank you, Lea. And if we have any questions, this is a great time.
Is there a brand in the Web3 space that you like? I mean, in terms of pure branding, how it is being developed and stuff?
It's difficult because the brands in Web3, I mean, if we're talking about Web3 as in crypto, are very targeted towards builders and developers at the moment. We build brands for people like us, and there's a little bit of a dichotomy here because if you go to the website, everybody says, we're bridging Web 2 and Web 3, but we're still talking to people in Web 3. Visually, though, there's a lot of beautiful projects out there, and I was complaining about the state of the space in 2018, but just coming to the conference today, I think visually we're really coming somewhere.
Hi, so you mentioned the overlap between tech and culture and community. It almost seems like a natural extension of that would be open source branding, because in Web3, the community is the propagator of the memes and oftentimes evolve the brand. Do you have any good case studies or examples that we could refer to for how that open source branding model can be seeded and then scale?
I think Bitcoin is actually a good example. I remember someone developed the concept of headless brands, but it can be open source, but we still need to give direction and a little push first. Then the symbol, the colors and everything around it can evolve, but we still need to gather around one initial banner in the end. But I think it is becoming open source, even if companies don't want it, because people reappropriate the codes no matter what.
Got you. Have you seen examples that are not Bitcoin, like more kind of like Web3 DAO type communities that have done this successfully?
I tried to work on some projects to create a framework for that to happen. We didn't manage so far. I have hope still.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Has your process changed from, transitioning from Web 2 to Web 3 in terms of involving communities beforehand or before you build a brand or having votes for stuff like that? Usually, it's kind of a hierarchical way of working, and working with the community can be, I think, different than.
Yes, definitely. And you said votes, and it's probably the thing that changed the most the way I work. Being in Web3 really opened my eyes to different ways of voting and governance. And I tried to use different tools to use also different ways of voting. I even tried quadratic voting so far, but no one understood it and didn't understand it either, so it didn't work out. But yes, definitely in that way.
So my question, what if there is a brand that really wants to talk to non-Web3 users and, share the Web3 culture and elements? Have you seen good examples of how do you use the right dosage of Web3 for non-Web3 communities?
That's a very good question. I think it depends also what the product is about. Like if you're trying to do something about trading, then you will embrace traditional codes. You can be a little bit more techy. You can be a little bit more intense. If you want to create a wallet, for example, and you want people to open a wallet not only for themselves, but also for their children to save some money for them in the future or something, then you will have something that is very friendly. So I think there's a few brands out there that are really coming there. Just, I was walking by, I think it was Solana today, and seeing like the really nice cartoonish 3D. I think that's the kind of stuff that speaks to a very broad audience visually, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your speech and this thought-provoking information. My question is, you mentioned several ways to build a strong Web3 brand, but can you define maybe one, without this thing, you would not definitely build a strong brand in Web3?
Like something that no one should do.
The most important thing.
The most important thing. It's a little bit cheesy, but I think doing it with your heart and really feeling it is important. And then it's also consistency. And that's something that is missing a lot in the space. To be consistent across all types of media when someone is doing a talk, when you're pushing for a video, when you're doing an NFT. Sometimes it feels that there's like different companies at once, and it would send a stronger message if everything was aligned and aligned towards the same idea.
Actually, I have a quick question. So I guess you could say in Web 2, marketing would be, selling a subscription service or selling access to a platform in exchange for the user's data, right? But in Web 3, there aren't any subscriptions, and we also don't collect users' data. So in that sense, how do you think about the user in Web 3 if you're not selling them something?
That's a very good question. I don't think you necessarily need to sell something to someone to consider them when doing a brand. There's a lot of brands out there that are not necessarily about selling a product. I'm thinking also about NGOs. You're actually asking for people to give you something and you don't give a lot in exchange, maybe a little bracelet for Christmas, but that's all. And it still works. So I don't think it matters so much. But the lack of data is important. That's why I also mentioned it in the talk, because we don't know so much about the people, and it makes communicating with them even more important than in Web 2.
Thanks. I think if there are no more questions, then we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Lea, for such an engaging talk.